Across the dark skies of our world, strange lights move in silence. They appear without warning, vanish without trace, leaving only questions. From the windswept moors of England to quiet American lakes to the dark waters of the Mississippi, witnesses tell of encounters beyond belief. These are not myths. These are the unexplained. On August 7, 1968, the air above Lake Champlain, just north of Burlington, Vermont, held a sliver of twilight as the sun sank behind distant hills. On the nearly deserted Buff Ledge Camp dock, an L-shaped wooden pier extending roughly 100 feet into the water, two camp employees lingered alone. 16-year-old Michael Lapp, who maintained the waterfront, and 19-year-old Janet Cornell, the skiing instructor, had volunteered to stay behind while most campers and counselors attended a swim meet in Burlington. A bright, star-like point appeared over the western sky. Michael at first thought it might be Venus, exclaiming in surprise, "Wow, Venus is falling!" But within moments, the light dropped rapidly toward them, revealing a cigar-shaped object aglow with an internal luminescence, hovering low over the water. From the underside emerged three smaller orb-like lights. They danced in tight formation, zigzagging, looping, pausing like falling leaves, and clearly moved under intelligent control. Two of those orbs peeled away sharply, accompanied by a resonant hum likened to 1,000 tuning forks. The remaining orb flew back over the water, vanished briefly, then reappeared, tilted, and plunged directly into the lake. Minutes later, it surfaced and glided toward the dock, closing to within 10 feet of the pair. Michael and Janet observed a disc-shaped craft with a transparent dome and a revolving halo of multicolored lights around its rim. Beneath, the vehicle emitted a steady vibration. Through the dome, Michael glimpsed two childlike humanoid figures, small in stature, hairless, with elongated necks and disproportionately large heads. Their big oval eyes wrapped around their heads, lacking visible ears or lips, a small slit-like mouth and nostril slits. They wore tight grayish or greenish uniforms that seemed part of a biological suit. As Michael gazed, he slapped his knee in disbelief. Unexpectedly, one of the beings mirrored the gesture. At that moment, buzzing hums of telepathic signals crowded his mind. One voice conveyed in mental communication, "We are not here to harm you." The beings said they had returned to Earth after the detonation of humanity's first atomic bombs, and they sought a form of energy they used against internal opponents in their own race. Throughout the encounter, Michael felt Janet beside him drifting into a trance, unresponsive, distant. Without warning, the craft moved directly overhead, and from beneath the dome, a blinding cone-shaped beam erupted. Michael grabbed Janet's shoulder and pulled both of them forcefully onto their backs on the dock. The brightness of the beam was so intense that he later reported seeing the bones in his hand, like an internal X-ray. The light was described by both as having a liquid-like sensation, as though their bodies floated, weightless. Michael felt terror surge, and he screamed, "We don't want to go!" But nothing changed. His consciousness dissolved. Darkness reclaimed the dock. When Michael stirred, the sky was fully black. Voices drifted down from above, the voices of returning swim team members. Through the gloom, the craft still hovered overhead, but now farther away. Two campers from the swim team, Susan Middleton and Barbara Bryant, ran toward the bluff and called out. At that instant, the craft extinguished its light and shot upward over the lake, flashing rapidly before vanishing entirely. Michael and Janet lay silent, exhausted, longing only for sleep. They said nothing about what had happened. Later, in private, they briefly noted their fatigue, but no sharing of details occurred. Summer ended, camp broke up, and the two parted ways, never meeting again that season. Michael carried a fragmentary memory. Janet had total amnesia regarding the event, only a vague sense that something had occurred. Over the next 5 years, Michael was plagued by intense nightmares, dreams of abduction, and vivid flash images he dismissed initially. Gradually, he realized his emotional turmoil might be tied to something real. He read about UFO abduction cases and decided to seek help. At age 26, he contacted the Center for UFO Studies, which linked him with ufologist Walter Webb. Webb reached out to Janet, but kept them from talking. Over 5 years, he conducted parallel investigations. In regressive hypnosis sessions with Harold J. Adelstein, DED, both Michael and Janet were interviewed separately. Their hypnotic memories showed remarkable agreement, approximately 70% concordance over the close encounter phase, and 68% alignment during the abduction procedures. Michael's regression revealed more detail. After unconsciousness, he was lifted by the beam into the smaller disk, then entered a much larger mothership in near space. He passed through a tube of light into a hangar-like room, escorted by a guide being. He watched Janet on an exam table, two beings shining a light into her eyes, scraping her skin, withdrawing blood and other bodily fluids from flexible tubes from body orifices, a triangular machine suspended from the ceiling. Michael's guide answered when Michael asked what they were doing: spawning consciousness. A third being monitored consoles with screens registering biometric data for both abductees. Michael later felt a helmet-like device placed on his own head as dozens of beings observed the results with satisfaction. Then came a surreal moment. His guide touched Michael's hands and the entire scene dissolved. He suddenly found himself in a park-like landscape under a purple sky, among ordinary people wandering, free but dazed. Janet appeared by his side, frightened. They fell asleep. The next memory he retained was falling through space toward a globe studded with moving television-like screens, each showing them lying on the dock. He passed through one of those screens and then abruptly regained awareness, back on the dock beside Janet, as if time had reversed itself. Janet's hypnosis session offered independent confirmation. She reported chilling sensations on the exam table, something pulling her hair, pinching her neck, and recalled physical examination, cold surfaces, and medical devices on her head and neck. Although she had remained mostly unconscious during the encounter, once she opened her eyes, she recoiled at seeing her captors. Her memory, as recounted under hypnosis, matched many of Michael's descriptions, although she had never heard them before. Investigation extended beyond the two abductees. Webb found several other camp members who had witnessed strange lights over Lake Champlain that same evening. 2 other employees reported similar UFO sightings earlier that summer. 2 returning swim team members confirmed seeing the craft depart. These corroborating testimonies lent weight to the event's nocturnal surprise. Psychological evaluations revealed that both Michael and Janet tested within normal ranges. Janet's profile showed no pathological tendencies, no fantasy proneness, socially well-adjusted. Michael's profile suggested optimism and energy, though potentially prone to embellishment, which did not invalidate his credibility. Janet passed a polygraph on her abduction testimony. Michael's result was inconclusive. Over decades, the case remained relatively obscure, its significance overshadowed by more famous abductions. Yet it stands out for 2 reasons. Michael and Janet never discussed their experience for 10 years, eliminating mutual influence. and Webb's 5-year rigorous investigation produced substantial witness corroboration, hypnosis-based concordance, and credible character assessments. The sun was setting over the Pascagoula River, casting long shadows across the still waters and the quiet shipyard where Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker had spent the day working. It was October 11th, 1973, an ordinary Thursday by all accounts. The heat of the day had begun to fade, replaced by a cooler southern breeze. Seeking to unwind, the two men, Charles, 42, weathered and thoughtful, and Calvin, 19, reserved and eager to please, drove to an old pier jutting into the river to fish and relax. Charles had worked hard his entire life, a Navy veteran with experience in welding and shipbuilding, respected by his peers. Calvin had recently come to Pascagoula for the job, quiet and unsure of the world, still figuring out his place in it. Though different in age and temperament, the two men had forged a respectful camaraderie. That evening, they shared the quiet comfort of casting lines into still water, surrounded by rustling reeds and the occasional cry of a bird. The city's industrial sounds faded into the background. It was just the river, the stars, and them. The moment it began, there was no warning. A buzzing, high-pitched hum sliced through the air. At first, they dismissed it as coming from a nearby factory or shipyard, but the sound grew stranger, more mechanical, resonant in a way that bypassed the ears and seemed to press directly against the bones. Then a glowing object appeared above the water, oval-shaped, metallic, nearly 30 feet across. It emitted a blue light that cast eerie reflections across the rippling water. Calvin froze. Charles turned to look, mouth slightly agape, eyes narrowing in disbelief. The craft hovered silently, then descended with smooth precision, coming to rest just above the ground, emitting no heat, no smell of fuel, nothing that made logical sense. Before either man could react further, a panel on the side of the craft opened. 3 figures emerged. They were not what anyone would expect aliens to look like, not the smooth-skinned, big-eyed grays of science fiction. These beings were roughly humanoid but grotesque, standing about 5 feet tall. Their skin was wrinkled and grayish, as if covered in elephant hide. Long carrot-like growths jutted from where ears or noses might have been. Instead of eyes, they had slits or indentations, and their hands ended in crab-like pincers. They moved in a stiff, unnatural manner, floating slightly above the ground rather than walking. One of the beings glided toward Charles and Calvin. Before they could run, before they could scream, a light enveloped them, cool and paralyzing. Calvin later described the sensation as if his body had shut down completely, even as his mind remained aware. Charles, a man who had seen the horrors of war, felt a sense of helplessness unlike anything he'd ever known. They were lifted from the ground not by touch, but by force, some invisible energy that defied explanation. Their bodies drifted toward the ship, weightless, limbs limp. Inside the craft, a dim, sterile atmosphere greeted them. The walls curved unnaturally, smooth and seamless. Calvin found himself separated from Charles, suspended in the air inside a small chamber. Something scanned him, a floating, metallic, eye-like device that rotated around his body. He couldn't speak, couldn't scream, could only feel the strange pressure moving through his skull, his chest, his limbs. Then a second being appeared, different from the others. This one was more delicate, more human-like in form, yet no real face. Calvin sensed something, not cruelty, but indifference, cold, mechanical examination. Charles experienced a similar ordeal. Though older and less prone to panic, he felt the same overwhelming helplessness.
He remembered lying on a table, unable to move as instruments touched him. There was no pain, but the violation was profound. A device hovered near his eye, then his groin. Thoughts flooded his mind, foreign, sharp, incomprehensible. Later, he would describe it as telepathic intrusion, like someone else rummaging through his thoughts. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The men were deposited back on the pier. The ship floated away, glowing softly, then shot into the sky with impossible speed. The buzzing sound faded into the night, replaced once more by the soft lapping of the river against the dock. The men sat there for a long time, trembling. Calvin was especially shaken. He cried, pacing in confusion, terrified of what had just happened. Charles tried to stay calm, to steady his friend, but his hands shook too. They couldn't make sense of it, none of it. It defied logic, memory, the physical rules of the world. Eventually, they drove to the local sheriff's office. Charles insisted they report it. Calvin was hesitant, afraid people would mock them or think they were drunk. But Charles believed that something extraordinary had occurred, something the world had a right to know about. At the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, they met with Captain Glenn Ryder and Sheriff Fred Diamond. The officers were skeptical. Two working men claiming to be abducted by aliens. It sounded ridiculous, but Charles and Calvin's fear was palpable. Their voices trembled, their body language screamed trauma. To test the sincerity of their story, the officers placed the two men in a room and left them alone, secretly recording their conversation. The tape would later become a key piece of the case. If the two men had fabricated the story, this would be where they'd congratulate each other or slip up. But what the tape revealed was not rehearsed. It was raw. It was terrified. Calvin, nearly hysterical, whispered about the beings, about how he thought he was going to die. Charles tried to calm him, but was clearly shaken too. "Jesus Christ, son, they better believe us. We ain't lying," Charles said. The sheriff's department eventually contacted Keesler Air Force Base. The men were taken there for medical evaluation. No signs of drugs or alcohol were found. Their stories, told separately, remained consistent. They described the same beings, the same light, the same sensations. Still, many dismissed them. Skeptics claimed it was a hoax or a hallucination, but others listened. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a respected astronomer and one-time government consultant on UFOs, took interest in the case. He visited Pascagoula to interview the men. Though Hynek had grown skeptical of many UFO reports over the years, he found Charles and Calvin's story compelling, especially their emotional reactions and the strangeness of the entities they described. They didn't match any known popular alien trope at the time. In the weeks and months that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Newspapers, radio, and television stations picked it up. Reporters swarmed Pascagoula. Charles agreed to speak publicly, though not for fame. He felt it was important to share what had happened. Calvin, however, retreated. The attention overwhelmed him. He had never wanted the spotlight and became reclusive, haunted by anxiety and reoccurring nightmares. As the years passed, Charles continued to tell his story. He remained consistent, even as public interest waned. He went on to write a book about the experience. Calvin, for decades, stayed silent, rarely granting interviews. He lived with the trauma quietly, never quite healing. But the memory never faded. Then, nearly 45 years later, Calvin broke his silence. In 2018, he published his own account of the abduction. Older now, and with Charles long passed away, he felt ready. His book, Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter, detailed the events from his perspective, including parts he'd never spoken about. He claimed there were more beings aboard the craft, humanoid figures, and that he'd experienced a kind of communication that lingered for years afterward. He even believed they'd visited him in dreams, in moments of sleep paralysis, or something deeper. Calvin's return to the public eye reignited interest in the case. UFO researchers began re-examining the original evidence. New witnesses came forward, locals who had seen strange lights in the sky that night in 1973, but had been too afraid to speak up. Even documents surfaced from military archives, noting unusual radar activity along the Gulf Coast that same night. The Pascagoula Incident, once dismissed as a sideshow in UFO lore, gained new credibility. In a time when governments around the world were slowly acknowledging the existence of unexplained aerial phenomena, Charles and Calvin's story took on renewed significance. To believers, it was one of the most credible abduction stories on record, told by two men who never sought fame, whose fear was genuine, and whose lives were profoundly changed. To skeptics, it remained an unsolved mystery, perhaps a hallucination, perhaps a hoax, but one that had never been convincingly debunked.
But for Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, the truth was not up for debate. It had happened. They had lived it. They bore the scars, emotional, psychological, and, in Calvin's case, even physical. He would later claim that strange marks had appeared on his body afterward, that he had suffered seizures and unexplained visions. And what of the beings? Were they scientists, explorers, something stranger? Neither man could say. They hadn't been tortured exactly, but they hadn't been treated like equals either. To the entities, they were specimens, creatures to be collected, studied, and returned. The encounter had shattered their understanding of the world. As the decades passed, the pier where it all happened slowly deteriorated, overgrown with weeds, forgotten by time. Yet the story lingered, passed along in whispered conversations, late-night radio shows, and UFO documentaries. It remained one of the few abduction cases where both witnesses passed polygraph tests, gave consistent accounts, and showed real, lasting trauma. In the end, the Pascagoula abduction wasn't just about lights in the sky or strange creatures. It was about two ordinary men thrust into an extraordinary situation. Men who didn't ask to be believed, only to be heard. Men whose lives were split into before and after that warm October night by the river. And in that liminal space between memory and mystery, between fear and belief, the truth of what happened still waits, hovering just out of reach, like the craft that disappeared into the Mississippi sky all those years ago. The desert air was still that morning in March 1956 as dawn crept over the Jornada del Muerto region near Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. The world remained quiet save for the distant drone of military activity. Sergeant Jonathan Lovette and Major William Cunningham had been assigned a routine mission: search and recover debris from a failed missile test in the White Sands Proving Grounds, a task that usually meant long hours under a punishing sun, with little more than scorched sand, fragments of twisted metal, and silence. They arrived early, their jeep crunching over sun-baked gravel. Lovette, young and sarcastic, stepped out first, stretching. Cunningham, older, meticulous, retrieved his clipboard and surveyed the landscape with a seasoned gaze. They had done this many times before, but this day would not end with debris collection. This day would enter military lore in whispered tones and confidential memos buried in file cabinets. The sun had only just cleared the mountains when Cunningham heard it.
An unnatural whirring, faint at first, but distinct. He looked up, shielding his eyes. Overhead, a flash of silver darted across the sky, smooth, fast, and completely silent. Lovette didn't notice. He was already out in the dunes, scanning the area with a handheld metal detector. Then came the scream. It was not the kind of scream that comes from injury or panic. It was primal, raw. Cunningham dropped the clipboard and bolted toward the sound, rounding a dune just in time to witness something no training could have prepared him for. Hovering above the sand was a disc-shaped craft, matte black and disturbingly silent. Below it, in a beam of bluish light, floated Lovette. Arms flailing, mouth agape. His body was lifted off the ground, drawn toward the underside of the craft. Cunningham froze. The air around him was charged, humming low in his ears. He reached for his sidearm instinctively, but never drew it. He could only watch, paralyzed. Within seconds, Lovette was gone, sucked into the ship, the beam vanishing with him. The disc paused for a moment longer, then shot into the sky at an impossible speed, leaving a trail of heat and displaced air. Then, silence. Cunningham stood alone, shaking. Sweat poured down his back despite the cool morning. Lovette's footprints remained in the sand. His gear was scattered. Detector, hat, a single boot. But he was gone. Radioing back to base in a daze, Cunningham barely managed to articulate what had happened. He knew how it would sound: hallucination, heat stroke. He didn't care. They needed to find Lovette. A full search team was deployed within the hour. Military helicopters and ground units scoured the area for 2 full days. They found no signs of the craft, no scorched marks, no residual radiation, just desert. And then, on the 3rd morning, they found the body. Roughly 10 miles from the abduction site, Lovette's remains lay at the bottom of a shallow ravine. It was not a typical recovery. His body was mutilated, surgically so. The tongue had been removed cleanly from the base. The eyes were gone. The genitalia had been excised. The body had been drained entirely of blood, without a single drop found at the scene. Even stranger, there was no sign of animal interference or decay. It was as if the body had been preserved, then dropped there deliberately. The retrieval team went silent. The official report labeled it a high-security incident. The autopsy, conducted under the supervision of Air Force intelligence, was immediately classified. Witnesses signed non-disclosure agreements. Cunningham, shaken and now under psychiatric review, was reassigned. But the truth didn't stay buried. In the years that followed, whispers of the Lovette-Cunningham Incident circulated through underground UFO research circles and within certain intelligence communities. A document, allegedly from a classified Air Force intelligence memo, surfaced in the 1980s, describing the incident in chilling detail. It mentioned surgical precision, the absence of bleeding, and tissue analysis that revealed unknown enzymes in the muscular tissue. It also referenced a connection to similar cattle mutilation cases reported in the Southwest during the same era. Some believed the story was a fabrication, Cold War disinformation designed to test loyalty and leaks within the intelligence community. But others, especially those familiar with Project Grudge and the early roots of what would become MJ-12, believed it was all too real. Major Cunningham never spoke publicly about what he saw. He retired from the Air Force in the early 1970s and disappeared from the public record. Friends said he was never the same after that morning, haunted, withdrawn. Some claimed he kept a private journal, though it has never surfaced. In 1956, no official UFO program had yet acknowledged the possibility of hostile or biological encounters. But internally, the Air Force was already collecting data. Operation Blue Book was still young, and most encounters were dismissed with rational explanations. But what happened in the New Mexico desert couldn't be written off as weather balloons or swamp gas. It was something else. Something far beyond the scope of Cold War paranoia. The autopsy report, according to leaked documents, included precise language that sent chills down even the most skeptical readers. The report stated, "Subject's body shows evidence of systemic exsanguination through unknown means. Precision incisions inconsistent with known surgical techniques. Complete absence of defensive wounds or trauma consistent with known weapons." A final note read, "Nature of mutilation suggests intent beyond interrogation or standard biological study. Motivation unknown." If true, it meant the perpetrators were intelligent, purposeful, possibly indifferent to human life or ethics. The story only deepened as other military personnel came forward in later years. Some claimed to have been shown photographs of the body during classified briefings. Others spoke of strange radar returns over Holloman in the days following the event. Even civilians living near the base described unusual lights in the sky, electrical interference, and bizarre animal disappearances during that same week in 1956. A retired intelligence officer, interviewed anonymously in the 1990s, claimed that the Lovette-Cunningham case was considered a benchmark inside certain black projects. A case that proved not just that extraterrestrial entities were observing Earth, but they were conducting experiments. Unethical ones, cold, clinical, and deeply disturbing. Skeptics argue the case has too many hallmarks of an urban myth: convenient secrecy, untraceable documents, and a lack of official admission. But believers point to patterns, similar mutilation cases, similar abduction accounts, and a consistent psychological profile among the witnesses: trauma, PTSD, and lifelong silence. One curious detail often overlooked is the geography of the event. The Jornada del Muerto, translated as Journey of the Dead Man, has long been a place of death, legend, and secrecy. The nearby White Sands area is home to countless experimental programs, both foreign and domestic. But perhaps it also drew the attention of others, those not from here, those watching. In more recent years, with the declassification of certain Air Force records and the slow acknowledgement of unexplained aerial phenomena by government agencies, the Lovette-Cunningham Incident has resurfaced in a new light, not as a fringe tale, but as a potential data point in a growing archive of non-human encounters. Today, no official monument marks the place where Lovette vanished. The desert has reclaimed the terrain. Wind has erased the footprints. But somewhere, perhaps in a drawer labeled Above Top Secret, his case remains. A chilling reminder that the universe is more complex and possibly more dangerous than we're prepared to understand. Was it an experiment gone wrong? A biological sample taken without consent? A message? Or simply observation by a species incapable of empathy? No one knows. But for Sergeant Jonathan Lovette, the answer came not in words, but in silence, bloodless precision, and the vast, unknowable dark of a ship that vanished into the morning sky.
The wind over Ikley Moor carried with it a lonely, almost mournful hum that seemed to whisper through the heather and grass. The moor stretched endlessly under a steel-gray winter sky, its rolling expanse broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop and gnarled tree leaning against the elements. It was early morning on December 1st, 1987, a day like countless others in West Yorkshire, cold enough to sting the skin, but still enough to invite the kind of quiet solitude that only wide-open countryside could give. A man named Philip Spencer walked steadily along a faint track, his breath pluming in the frosty air. A camera swung gently from its strap over his shoulder, the kind of reflex tool any keen photographer kept close, ready for the moment when light and subject aligned. Philip wasn't here by accident. His destination was over the ridge toward Menston, where his father-in-law lived. He'd taken the shortcut over the moor countless times before. The path was quicker than the winding roads, and he liked the silence it offered. Yet beneath the tranquility of the moor, there was always a strange undercurrent, a sensation difficult to explain. People in the surrounding villages sometimes spoke of odd lights in the sky, strange movements in the mist, and eerie silences where there should have been the call of birds. Philip had heard these tales, but like most, he dismissed them as folklore or tricks of the mind. That morning, as he crested a slope, the distant village lay hidden beyond folds of land. The wind picked up, hissing through the grass. That's when his eyes caught something unusual ahead, perhaps 50 yards away, something that didn't fit with the earth tones of the landscape. A small figure stood partially obscured by brush. It was upright, but not human in any ordinary sense. It moved slightly, and in that motion he caught a better look. Its skin appeared a pale green, its head larger than seemed proportionate, and its arms hung oddly. Its height was perhaps just over 4 feet, its stance alert, almost deliberate, as though aware of him. Instinctively, he reached for his camera. His heart rate quickened, not in fear exactly, but in a strange rush of disbelief. The logical part of his mind scrambled for explanations. A child in a costume, some prank. Yet the figure was motionless now, regarding him with a stillness that was unnerving. The cold metal of the camera felt grounding in his hands as he raised it, adjusted the focus, and clicked the shutter. The sound was small, but seemed to echo unnaturally in the emptiness around them. The moment the shutter fell, the figure reacted. It turned sharply and began to move away, not hurriedly, but with a smooth, strange gait, as though gliding over uneven ground. Philip, suddenly seized by a mix of curiosity and an almost primal need to know, followed. The ground here was soft in places, sucking at his boots, but the figure moved with impossible ease. Ahead, rising slightly above the moor's undulating terrain, loomed an odd glow, faint but growing stronger. The light came from a low-lying bank of mist, or what it seemed like mist at first. As Philip closed the distance, he realized it wasn't behaving like fog at all. It pulsed faintly, colors shifting within it in ways no natural phenomenon should. The figure he followed entered the glowing shroud without hesitation. Philip stopped at the edge. His breath came faster, his senses sharpened. Every instinct told him not to step forward. Yet in the same instant, an overwhelming pull gripped him, an urge that bypassed reason entirely. It was as if the glow itself was calling to him. He stepped forward. The moment his foot crossed the threshold of the light, the world shifted. Sound dulled, the wind disappeared, and his vision warped. Shapes moved within the glow, shapes metallic and curved, like the hull of some enormous craft. He couldn't tell if it hovered above the ground or sat upon it, for the haze obscured the edges. Then, with a sudden and total disconnection from the earth, he felt himself lifted, not by arms, not by machinery he could see, but by a force that enveloped him completely. Philip's awareness fragmented. The moor was gone. He found himself inside an enclosed space, bathed in a cold, clinical light.
The air was heavy with a sterile scent, not unlike a hospital's, but sharper, metallic. Smooth walls curved upward into a dome, without visible seams or corners. There was no clear source of the illumination. It simply existed everywhere. He tried to move, but his limbs felt sluggish, as if under some kind of restraint.
Figures emerged from the periphery, several of them, their forms similar to the one he'd seen on the Moor, but taller, more imposing. Their skin reflected the light in a way that was almost pearlescent, and their large, black, almond-shaped eyes locked onto him with unsettling focus. They spoke without speaking. A pressure bloomed in his mind, a flood of impressions, colors, and emotions rather than words. It was communication beyond language, efficient, direct, and undeniable. Images flashed in his thoughts, vast stretches of space, planets he did not recognize, and a sense of movement between them. He felt as though they were probing his mind, not in malice, but with clinical detachment, studying his thoughts, his memories, even his emotions. Time dissolved into something meaningless. Whether minutes or hours passed, he couldn't tell. He became aware of lying on a flat surface, a strange hum vibrating through it. A device passed over him, featureless, yet radiating purpose. He felt warmth in some places, coolness in others, as though he was being scanned in layers far deeper than skin. There was no pain, only an odd detachment from his own body, like watching from somewhere just outside himself. At one point, his attention was drawn to a large curved window, or something like a window, through which a landscape rolled beneath them. It was not Earth. He saw jagged mountains under a pale green sky, rivers glowing faintly as if lit from within, and structures that seemed grown rather than built. The sight was fleeting, and before he could comprehend it fully, the vision dissolved, replaced by darkness. When awareness returned, he was back on the moor. The cold air rushed in like a slap, his lungs filling as though he had been holding his breath. The glow was gone, the figure gone, and the moor lay as it always had, silent, windswept, indifferent. His camera still hung from his neck, heavier than he remembered. He looked at his watch. A jolt of confusion ran through him. The time was more than 2 hours later than it should have been. The walk across the moor was short. He could not have been gone that long. Yet the evidence was there in the unyielding tick of the hands. The world around him seemed unchanged, yet he was certain something irrevocable had happened. He continued on toward Menston in a kind of daze, his thoughts a tangle of disbelief and awe. By the time he reached the village, the reality of normal life pressed back in. People moved about their day, oblivious to the fact that the moor behind them might have just hosted something beyond comprehension. Later, when the film from his camera was developed, one image stood out among the mundane shots of landscape and stone walls. The photograph was grainy, the light dim, but the figure was there, a small, humanoid shape standing in the moorland scrub, just as he remembered. Critics would call it inconclusive. Skeptics would claim it a trick of perspective, a misidentified person, or even an outright hoax. But to Philip, no argument could erase what he experienced: the strange light, the pull, the silent communication. In the weeks that followed, his sleep was fractured by dreams that felt less like imagination and more like fractured memories. Images of alien skies, the black eyes watching him, and the sensation of floating between worlds plagued him. He tried to tell himself they were dreams,
Yet deep down, he knew they were not creations of his mind. They were echoes of something real. When he eventually spoke to researchers, they noted his sincerity, his lack of any clear motive to fabricate the encounter. Under hypnosis, fragments of his experience emerged more vividly, aligning with the accounts of others who claimed similar encounters across the globe, beings of small stature, large eyes, and technology beyond human understanding. The Moor, for all its quiet beauty, remained unchanged, still rolling under the weight of the Yorkshire sky. Yet for Philip Spencer, it would never again be just open land. It was now a threshold, a place where reality had thinned enough for something from beyond to reach through and take him, if only for a few hours. And somewhere out there, perhaps under another sky, perhaps in the depths of space itself, the beings who had studied him might remember the man who had walked alone across Ikley Moor on a cold December morning, carrying nothing more than a camera and a curious mind, until the day the Moor answered back. We've reached the edge of what can be told, and yet the questions remain. Were these only shadows in the night, or glimpses into something far greater than ourselves? The truth drifts between the stars and our imagination, waiting for those willing to see. Until the next signal, this has been End of Transmission.